There's something heartbreaking about watching a good man get laughed at for making what seems like the wrong choice. Sometimes we all feel like that beaten-up mule standing in the corner while everyone admires the shiny horses. The rancher offered any horse for free to the Apache tracker at Copper Ridge. The crowd expected Malu to pick a stallion or mare. He walked to an old scarred mule instead. "I'll take the mule," he said. Everyone laughed. The rancher slapped his knee. 2 weeks later, Malu rode back from the dangerous Badlands with stolen rifles. The fancy horses couldn't have survived that rocky canyon. The mule made it through everything. What did Malu see that the others missed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Arizona Territory stretched endlessly under a copper sky in the summer of 1885, where dust devils danced across the desert floor like spirits seeking redemption. At the crossroads of two worn trails sat Copper Ridge Trading Post, its weathered adobe walls offering sanctuary to travelers and those seeking refuge from the unforgiving wilderness. Malu stood in the shade, watching the afternoon crowd gather around Buck Harrison's corral. At 43, the Apache tracker moved with quiet confidence, his weathered face bearing the deep lines of someone who had spent decades under the desert sun. His dark eyes held the patient wisdom of his grandfather's teachings. The smooth river stone in his pocket, his grandfather's tracking stone, had been worn smooth by generations of Apache hands. It connected him to ancestral knowledge that ran deeper than the shallow boasts echoing from the corral. His grandfather had taught him that true strength wasn't always the loudest or flashiest, but often the most enduring. Buck Harrison cut an imposing figure at 52, his success in cattle evident in both his generous gut and his even more generous opinion of himself. The silver belt buckle catching the dying light had cost more than most men earned in a year, a symbol of wealth that had blinded him to values that couldn't be purchased. "Gentlemen," Buck announced, slapping his hand on the weathered fence rail, "any man brave enough to track down those rifle thieves in the Badlands can pick any horse from my corral, absolutely free." The crowd murmured appreciatively. These were fine animals. A bay stallion with legs like steel springs, a paint mare, with the alert stance of a born runner, and a black gelding whose muscled shoulders spoke of both power and speed. Sarah Chen emerged from the trading post's cool interior, wiping her hands on her apron. At 38, the Chinese-Irish woman had inherited her father's business acumen and her mother's fierce independence. She had built the trading post into the most successful operation between Tucson and Phoenix through fair dealing and an uncanny ability to see character beneath surface appearances. Old Pete sat on the porch steps, whittling juniper with practiced hands. At 67, the former cavalry scout had seen enough of life to recognize when a man was playing to the crowd rather than speaking from genuine generosity. The theft of 3 military rifles from the Army supply wagon had set the entire territory on edge. The bandits had vanished into the maze of canyons and mesas that local folks called the Badlands, a place where the earth seemed to crack open and swallow anyone foolish enough to venture too deep. Malu had been studying the track since the robbery 3 days prior. The sign told him things the sheriff's posse had missed. These weren't desperate men making random strikes. The hoofprints showed discipline, military precision. The way they had struck and vanished suggested knowledge of terrain that came from careful scouting, not luck. "What about you, Malu?" Buck's voice carried that particular tone white men used when they wanted to sound generous, while ensuring everyone understood they were doing a favor. "You're the best tracker in 3 counties." The crowd turned to study. The Apache tracker, with the mixture of respect and condescension that had defined Malu's entire adult life. They needed his skills often enough, finding lost cattle, tracking escaped prisoners, guiding supply wagons through treacherous mountain passes, but they never quite let him forget that he lived between 2 worlds. Malu walked slowly toward the corral, his moccasined feet making no sound on the packed earth. He had learned long ago that patience revealed more than haste ever could. The horses turned to watch his approach, their ears pricked forward with instinctive recognition. The bay stallion pranced nervously, all energy and fire but lacking the steady temperament needed for long pursuits through difficult terrain. The paint mare stood alert and intelligent, but her delicate legs suggested she would struggle with rocky footing. The black gelding possessed both strength and endurance, but his high head carriage spoke of an animal that would panic in narrow canyon passages. At the far end of the corral, mostly ignored by the admiring crowd, stood a mule. Cisco was perhaps 15 years old, his coat dusty brown and marked by scars of a working life. His ears swiveled constantly as he monitored his surroundings with alertness that had kept him alive through dangers that would have killed flashier animals. The mule's eyes met Malu's with intelligence that spoke of wisdom earned through experience rather than breeding. Here was an animal that had learned to think before acting, to test each step before committing his weight, to conserve energy for when it would be needed most. Malu's grandfather had taught him that the strongest trees weren't always the tallest, but those with the deepest roots. The fastest rivers weren't necessarily the most powerful, but those that never stopped flowing. The same principle applied to choosing a partner for the work that lay ahead. "I'll take the mule," Malu said simply, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of a man who had made his decision based on knowledge rather than appearance. The laughter started slowly, rippling through the crowd like wind through dry grass. Buck Harrison's face reddened as he slapped his knee, the silver buckle catching the light as his belly shook with mirth. "The mule?" Buck wheezed between laughs. "Malu, friend, I'm offering you the finest horseflesh in the territory, and you want that old pack animal?" Sarah Chen studied the tracker's face, searching for some sign that he might be joking. She had learned to respect Malu's judgment in most matters, but this choice seemed to defy all logic. Old Pete stopped whittling, his experienced eyes moving between Malu and the mule with growing thoughtfulness. He had served with Apache scouts during his cavalry days and learned to never dismiss their choices too quickly. Malu approached Cisco slowly, extending his hand for the mule to investigate. The animal's soft nose brushed against his palm, and he felt recognition pass between them. Two beings who understood that survival often depended on qualities invisible to those who judged by appearances alone. The mule's worn leather halter spoke of years of faithful service, of carrying supplies through mountain passes where horses would balk, of finding water in places where other animals would perish from thirst. The scars weren't signs of weakness, but badges of endurance. "Cisco's been over every trail in this territory," Malu said, running his hand along the mule's neck. "He knows where water hides, where the ground stays solid, where a man can travel without being seen. You can't teach that to a young horse, no matter how fast or pretty it might be." Buck Harrison's laughter died as he realized Malu was serious. The offer had been made publicly, with witnesses, and his reputation for keeping his word was part of what made him successful in business. "Well then," Buck said, his voice tight with controlled irritation, "I suppose Cisco it is. Don't come crying to me when that old mule leaves you stranded in some canyon." As the crowd began to disperse, still chuckling about the tracker's strange choice, Sarah Chen approached Malu with concern and curiosity. "Are you certain about this?" she asked quietly. "Those Badlands have claimed better men than most, riding much finer horses." Malu's hand never left the mule's neck as he considered her question. In his pocket, his grandfather's tracking stone seemed to pulse with ancient wisdom. "My grandfather used to say that the river finds the sea not because it's the fastest water, but because it never stops flowing," Malu replied. "Sometimes the longest path is also the surest." As the sun set over Copper Ridge, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Malu led Cisco toward the small adobe house he called home. Tomorrow would bring the real test of his choice, when they would venture into country that had swallowed other trackers whole. 3 days after choosing the mule, Malu was mending tack outside his adobe house when he heard the thunder of hooves approaching from the east. A desperate family raced into Copper Ridge, their horses lathered with sweat and foam, eyes wild with exhaustion. The Hendersons had pushed their animals to the breaking point, and the reason became clear the moment they reached the trading post. They took Tommy. Martha Henderson's voice cracked as she slid from her saddle, her calico dress torn and dusty. "The bandits, they came in the night and took our boy." Her husband Jack supported her trembling frame, his own face ashen beneath 3 days of stubble. At 45, he had the weathered look of a man who had carved his living from unforgiving land. But now he appeared broken, aged a decade in mere hours. The crowd that gathered around the Hendersons grew quickly as word spread through the settlement. Sarah Chen emerged from her store, old Pete hobbled down from his porch, and even Buck Harrison abandoned his afternoon siesta to hear the terrible news. "How many were there?" Sheriff Coleman asked, his badge catching the late afternoon sun. At 58, Coleman had kept the peace in Copper Ridge for 12 years. But his experience had been limited to drunken cowboys and claim disputes. Nothing like organized kidnapping. 4, maybe 5, Jack Henderson replied, his voice hollow with shock. They knew exactly what they were doing. Struck fast, took Tommy, and were gone before we could even saddle up to follow. Malu approached quietly, studying the torn piece of cloth that Martha clutched in her white-knuckled fist. It was a fragment from a military survey map, the kind used by cavalry units to navigate unfamiliar territory. The edges were deliberately torn, but he could make out part of a canyon system marked with detailed notations about water sources and defensive positions. "They left this behind," Martha whispered, holding out the map fragment. It was pinned to Tommy's bedroom window with a knife. The torn map fragment told Malu more than the Hendersons realized. This wasn't the work of common bandits operating on instinct and opportunity. The military precision of the markings, the detailed knowledge of terrain features, and the calculated psychological impact of leaving evidence behind, all of it spoke to something far more organized and dangerous than typical frontier outlaws. "Sheriff!" Buck Harrison stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority that came with being the wealthiest man in 3 counties. "My boys and I can have a posse ready to ride within the hour. We've got the best horses in the territory." Coleman nodded gratefully, but Malu noticed the doubt flickering in the lawman's eyes. They all knew what lay beyond the desert floor, the maze of canyons and mesas that locals called the Badlands, where the earth seemed to crack open and swallow anyone foolish enough to venture too deep. "Begging your pardon, Sheriff," old Pete spoke up from the edge of the crowd, his weathered voice carrying the weight of hard-earned experience. "But horses won't do much good where those bandits are likely holed up. I rode patrol through that country for 15 years, and I seen plenty of good cavalry mounts come back without their riders." A murmur of uneasiness rippled through the assembled townspeople. They had all heard the stories. Experienced trackers who had ventured into the Badlands and simply vanished. Their remains never found, their fate left to the imagination. Malu stepped forward, holding the map fragment up to catch the dying light. The torn edges matched perfectly with detailed topographical knowledge he had gained through years of tracking through every canyon and mesa in the region. "This isn't random," he said quietly, his voice carrying the certainty of a man who read sign the way others read books. "They know that country better than most. They know exactly where to take a hostage, so no ordinary posse can follow. Then what do you suggest?" Sarah Chen asked, her practical nature cutting through the growing despair. "We can't just leave that boy out there." Malu felt the weight of his grandfather's tracking stone in his pocket, smooth and warm against his fingers. The old Apache had taught him that sometimes the most difficult path was also the most necessary, that wisdom often required choosing the road others wouldn't take. "I can track them," he said simply, "but not with horses. That terrain will break the finest stallion before you're 5 miles in. The canyons are too narrow, the footing too treacherous, the water too scarce." Buck Harrison's face reddened with indignation. "Now hold on, Malu. You're talking about that broken-down mule again, aren't you?" This is a boy's life we're discussing, not some game to prove a point. The accusation stung, but Malu had learned long ago that anger was a luxury he couldn't afford when lives hung in the balance. He studied the map fragment again, noting the precise military notations that marked not just terrain, features but tactical positions, places where a small force could hold off a much larger pursuing party. Tommy's life is exactly why I need Cisco, Malu replied calmly. He's been through country that would kill other animals. He knows where to find water when the obvious sources run dry, how to navigate loose rock without starting slides that would trap us both. Martha Henderson looked up from her husband's supporting arms, hope and desperation warring in her tear-streaked face. You really think you can find him? You think you can bring our boy home? The weight of that question settled on Malu's shoulders like a physical burden. He had tracked lost cattle through blizzards, guided supply wagons across desert stretches that claimed weaker men, and found water in places where others saw only death. But this was different. This was a 15-year-old boy whose only crime was being in the wrong place when ruthless men decided to make their move. I can try, he said, knowing that honesty served better than false confidence. But if I'm going into that country, I'm going with the partner that gives us the best chance of coming back alive. Sheriff Coleman nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in Malu's words, even if he didn't fully understand the reasoning. How long do you need to prepare? I can be ready at first light, Malu replied. But I need to study this map fragment first. See what else it might tell us about where they're headed. As the crowd began to disperse into worried clusters, discussing the implications and possibilities, Sarah Chen approached Malu with a bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. Supplies, she said simply. Trail rations, medical kit, extra ammunition. And this, she pressed a small leather pouch into his hands. It was Tommy's. He carved it himself last Christmas. His mother thought you might need something of his for tracking. Inside the pouch was a small wooden horse, carved with the careful attention of young hands still learning their craft. The boy had painted it brown and black, with white markings that resembled the horses in Buck Harrison's corral. It was the work of someone who dreamed of owning a fine mount someday, who saw beauty in the powerful animals that represented freedom and adventure. Malu closed his fingers around the carved horse, feeling the weight of innocent dreams and the responsibility they represented. Tomorrow, he and Cisco would venture into country that had claimed experienced men riding far better animals. But tonight, he would prepare with the methodical care that had kept him alive through decades of dangerous work. As darkness settled over Copper Ridge, Malu sat by lamplight, studying every detail of the torn map fragment, memorizing the terrain features, and trying to read between the lines of what the bandits' route might reveal about their ultimate destination. In the corral behind his house, Cisco stood patiently, resting one hind leg in the timeless pose of an animal completely at peace with itself. The mule didn't know that tomorrow would test every assumption the good people of Copper Ridge held about value, wisdom, and survival. He only knew that his partner was preparing for another journey, and that when morning came, he would be ready to go wherever the trail might lead. Dawn came soft and pink over the Arizona desert as Malu approached Cisco in the pale morning light. The mule stood quietly in the small corral, his dark eyes alert and knowing, as if he understood that today would be different from their usual journeys into the wilderness. The worn leather halter that encircled Cisco's head had been with him for nearly a decade, soft and supple from years of faithful service. It bore the scars and stains of countless miles through desert heat and mountain cold, each mark a testament to the bond between man and animal that had carried them through dangers others couldn't imagine. Malu's hands moved with practiced efficiency as he checked every strap and buckle, every piece of equipment that would keep them alive in the unforgiving country ahead. He'd learned long ago that preparation was the difference between coming home and becoming another cautionary tale whispered around campfires. "You sure about this, old friend?" he murmured, running his hand along Cisco's neck. The mule's ears swiveled toward him, and he found reassurance in the animal's calm presence. They had been through difficult country before, but never with stakes this high. The supplies Sarah Chen had provided were carefully distributed across Cisco's back, water for 3 days, though Malu knew where to find more if they were careful. Trail rations that would sustain a man, but not burden an animal already carrying the weight of their survival. Ammunition for his rifle, medical supplies for injuries he hoped they wouldn't need. As he worked, Malu's mind wandered to the stories his grandfather had told around winter fires. Tales of Apache warriors who had survived impossible odds, not through strength or speed, but through understanding the land and choosing their battles wisely. The old man had often spoken of a warrior named Silent Wolf, who had escaped cavalry pursuit by riding a sure-footed Mustang through terrain where the army's horses couldn't follow. The white soldiers, his grandfather had said. They always chose the biggest, strongest horses. But Silent Wolf understood that survival wasn't about power. It was about endurance, about finding the path others couldn't see. Buck Harrison arrived just as the sun cleared the eastern mountains, leading a small group of his ranch hands mounted on some of his finest animals. The bay stallion pranced and snorted in the cool morning air, eager for action, while the paint mare danced sideways with nervous energy. Last chance. "Malu!" Buck called out, his voice carrying across the quiet morning. "I've got Thunder here saddled and ready. He's the fastest horse in 3 counties, and he's got the stamina to run all day." The stallion was indeed magnificent, his coat gleaming like polished copper in the morning light. His muscles rippled beneath his skin as he moved, and his bright eyes spoke of intelligence and spirit. Any reasonable man would see the logic in Buck's offer. But Malu had spent his life learning that reasonable wasn't always right, that the obvious choice wasn't always the wise choice. He thought of the map fragment, with its detailed notations about narrow canyon passages and treacherous footing. He thought of water sources hidden in places where a nervous horse might refuse to venture. "I appreciate the offer," Malu replied, checking Cisco's girth one final time. "But we're partners, Cisco and me. We'd know each other's strengths." Old Pete hobbled over from his porch, his cane tapping against the packed earth. The former cavalry scout studied the mule, with eyes that had seen too much to be fooled by appearances. "I remember a mustanger named Diego," Pete said thoughtfully. "Used to work these parts before the Apache wars. He always rode mules when he was hunting the wild herds. Said horses were too proud for the kind of work that really mattered." Buck Harrison shook his head in obvious frustration. "Pride doesn't rescue kidnapped boys, Pete. Speed does. Strength does. Common sense does." The sound of approaching hooves interrupted the conversation as Martha and Jack Henderson arrived, their faces drawn with worry and sleepless nights. Martha carried a small bundle wrapped in blue cloth, more of Tommy's belongings to help with the tracking. "Mr. Malu," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This was Tommy's favorite shirt. And this—" She held up a simple leather cord with a small silver cross. "He never took it off. His grandmother gave it to him before she passed." Malu accepted the items with the reverence they deserved, understanding that he was being entrusted with more than just fabric and metal. These were pieces of a mother's heart, tokens of a life that hung in the balance somewhere in the vast wilderness ahead. "I'll bring him home," he said simply, though they both knew he was making a promise that the desert might not let him keep. As he secured the bundle to Cisco's pack, Malu caught sight of Sarah Chen watching from her store's doorway. The practical woman had dealt with enough frontier emergencies to know that good intentions didn't guarantee safe returns. But something in her expression suggested she understood his choice better than the others. The mule stood patiently through all the preparations, occasionally shifting his weight or swishing his tail at an early morning fly, but otherwise showing the calm steadiness that had made him invaluable on a dozen previous expeditions. His scars told stories of survival, the marks where thorns had caught him navigating narrow passages, the old rope burn on his shoulder from a rock slide that had nearly claimed them both 3 years earlier. Those scars weren't signs of weakness or clumsiness. They were proof that Cisco had faced dangers and kept going, that he had the kind of experience that couldn't be bought or bred, only earned through years of testing himself against an unforgiving landscape. "You ready, partner?" Malu asked, swinging up onto Cisco's back. The mule's gait was smooth and steady as they moved toward the edge of town, where the desert stretched endlessly toward the Badlands. Behind them, Buck Harrison's stallion fought against the bit, eager to prove himself in a race that would be decided not by speed but by wisdom. The paint mare stepped nervously, sensing the tension in her rider's body. Even the most experienced of Buck's ranch hands looked uncertain as they contemplated the country ahead, but Cisco moved with the quiet confidence of an animal who had learned that the fastest way through difficult country was often the slowest, that the surest path was rarely the most obvious one. His ears swiveled constantly, reading the desert morning for signs that others might miss. As they left the last buildings of Copper Ridge behind, Malu felt the familiar settling that came with beginning a serious journey. The weight of responsibility rode heavy on his shoulders, but it was balanced by the steady rhythm of Cisco's hooves against the hardpan, the reliable presence of a partner who had never let him down. The real test lay ahead, somewhere in the maze of canyons and mesas where desperate men held a 15-year-old boy whose only crime had been being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But for now, as the sun climbed higher and the desert began to show its true face, Malu was content to trust in the wisdom that had chosen endurance over flash, substance over appearance. The desert stretched endlessly before them as Malu and Cisco left the last traces of civilization behind. The morning sun climbed steadily, promising another day of scorching heat that would test both man and animal, before they found shelter in the evening shadows of the Badlands. Cisco's steady pace ate up the miles without waste or drama. His hooves found purchase on ground that would challenge flashier animals. His breathing remained even and controlled as they climbed the gradual rise toward the broken country ahead. The mule had learned long ago that survival was about conserving energy for when it would be needed most. 3 hours into their journey, Malu found the first clear sign of their quarry. The bandits' trail was easy enough to follow in the soft sand between creosote bushes, but what caught his attention was the deliberate nature of their passage. These weren't desperate men fleeing in panic. They moved with the measured confidence of soldiers following a predetermined route. He dismounted to study the hoofprints more closely, running his fingers along the edges where the horse's shoes had cut into the earth. 4 animals, as the Hendersons had reported, but the depth and spacing of the tracks told him these were quality mounts, well fed and well cared for. Not the kind of horses common bandits could afford. Tucked beneath a Palo Verde tree, almost hidden by fallen branches, was a small carved wooden horse. Tommy Henderson's toy, dropped or perhaps deliberately left as a sign for anyone who might follow. Malu picked it up carefully, noting how the boy had painted it to resemble Buck Harrison's prized stallion. All power and proud bearing. The carved horse seemed to mock his own choice as Cisco stood patiently nearby. His dusty brown coat and scarred hide, a stark contrast to the painted perfection in Malu's palm. But his grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. The tree that bends in the storm survives while the mighty oak breaks. They pushed deeper into the desert, following a trail that seemed almost too easy to read. The bandits made no effort to hide their passage, confident that no pursuit could follow where they were headed. As the sun reached its zenith, the landscape began to change, becoming more broken and hostile with each mile. The first real test came as they approached a narrow wash cut deep into the desert floor by centuries of flash floods. The banks were steep and crumbling, the bottom scattered with loose rocks that could snap a horse's leg or send rider and mount tumbling into the thorny embrace of waiting sholler cactus. Buck Harrison's stallion would have balked at such an obstacle, would have fought against his rider's attempts to navigate the treacherous descent. The paint mare might have made the attempt, but would have done so with nervous energy that increased the danger tenfold. Cisco studied the wash with calm intelligence, his ears swiveling as he assessed the challenge. Then, without drama or hesitation, he picked his way down the steep bank with the careful precision of an animal who understood that each step meant the difference between progress and disaster. Halfway across the rocky bottom, they encountered their first serious danger. A diamondback rattlesnake, thick as a man's arm and longer than most rifles, lay coiled in the shade of a boulder directly in their path. The serpent's rattle buzzed a warning that would have sent most horses into a panic that could prove fatal in such confined space. But Cisco had encountered rattlesnakes before. He stopped immediately at the sound, his body going perfectly still while his alert eyes located the source of the threat. There was no panic, no wild shying that might have sent them both tumbling into the rocks. Just patient waiting while Malu carefully guided them around the obstacle. "Good boy," Malu murmured, patting the mule's neck as they completed the crossing. "You've got more sense than most men I know." The afternoon brought them to the edge of the true Badlands, where the earth seemed to crack open in a maze of canyons and mesas that stretched to the horizon. Here the bandits' trail became more difficult to follow, not because they had tried to hide it, but because the rocky ground held sign differently than desert sand. Malu dismounted frequently to study the subtle marks that spoke of their quarry's passage. A scuff mark on a stone, a bent twig on a desert willow, the faint outline of a horseshoe on a patch of rare, soft earth. Each sign built a picture of men who knew this country well, who moved with confidence through terrain that would intimidate most travelers. As they climbed toward a narrow pass between towering red sandstone walls, Cisco's ears suddenly pricked forward in alert attention. The mule had heard something that Malu's human senses had missed, the sound of voices echoing off canyon walls somewhere ahead. They proceeded more carefully now, Cisco's hooves making almost no sound on the sandy bottom of the narrow passage. The mule seemed to understand instinctively that stealth was now more important than speed. That discovery could mean death for both of them and doom for the boy they sought to rescue. The voices grew clearer as they approached a bend in the canyon, and Malu could make out at least two different speakers. One voice was older, gravelly with the authority of command. The other was younger, nervous, asking questions about timing and distances. Hidden behind a screen of desert willows, Malu caught his first glimpse of the men who had taken Tommy Henderson. They wore the clothes of typical frontier drifters, but their bearing was different, too disciplined, too organized for common criminals. These men had military training, and recent training at that. The older man, clearly the leader, was studying a detailed map spread across a flat boulder. Even from a distance, Malu could see that it matched the military survey style of the torn fragment left at the Henderson Ranch. But this map was complete, showing not just terrain features but strategic positions, water sources, and what appeared to be escape routes. "The boy's slowing us down," the younger man complained. "Maybe we stick to the plan," the leader cut him off sharply. "The boy's our insurance. Without him, we're just thieves. With him, we control the situation." Malu eased back from his hiding place, his mind racing with the implications of what he had heard. This wasn't a simple kidnapping for ransom. These men were planning something larger, and Tommy Henderson was just a small piece in a much bigger scheme. As they carefully retreated from the bandit camp, Cisco moved with the silent precision that had saved their lives more than once. His hooves found secure footing even in the failing light. His breathing remained controlled, despite the growing tension. They made camp that night in a hidden alcove, where a seep provided enough water for both man and mule. As Cisco grazed quietly on whatever sparse grass he could find, Malu studied Tommy's carved horse by firelight and wondered what kind of men would use a child's dreams as leverage in whatever game they were playing. The wooden toy seemed to watch him with painted eyes that held all the innocence the bandits had stolen. Tomorrow would bring them deeper into the maze of canyons where the real dangers waited. But tonight, listening to Cisco's steady breathing and feeling the ancient comfort of his grandfather's tracking stone, Malu found strength in knowing they were exactly where they needed to be. The second day brought them deeper into the heart of the Badlands, where the morning sun painted the canyon walls in shades of blood and gold. The terrain grew increasingly treacherous as they followed the bandits, trailed through passages so narrow that Cisco's sides nearly brushed the weathered sandstone on both sides. Here was country that would have broken the spirit of Buck, Harrison's prize stallion, within hours. The footing was uncertain at best. Loose shale that could slide away without warning, hidden cracks that could trap an unwary hoof, and drops that appeared suddenly around blind corners with no room to turn back. But Cisco navigated each challenge with the patient wisdom of long experience. When the trail switched back down a steep slope littered with fallen rocks, he tested each step carefully before committing his weight. When they encountered a gap where part of the path had collapsed, he studied the obstacle with calm intelligence before finding the safest way across. It was in one of these narrow passages that Malu made the discovery that changed everything he thought he knew about their quarry. Wedged behind a fallen boulder, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, was a broken cavalry saber. The weapon's blade was snapped halfway along its length, but the brass hilt still bore the distinctive markings of a U.S. cavalry officer's dress sword. More telling were the initials engraved in the metal, J.M., and below them a date from just 2 years prior. Malu turned the broken saber over in his hands, reading the story it told. This wasn't some relic from the Apache wars of decades past. The metal was too clean, the break too recent. Someone had abandoned this weapon here within the last few months, probably during a hasty retreat when things went wrong. The implications were troubling. If the bandits had connections to active military personnel, it explained their knowledge of survey maps, their disciplined movement patterns, and their confidence in terrain that should have been unfamiliar to common criminals. As they continued deeper into the canyon system, the weather began to shift ominously. Dark clouds built along the western horizon, promising the kind of sudden, violent storm that could turn dry washes into raging torrents without warning. The air grew heavy and still, pressing down on them like a physical weight. Cisco's behavior changed subtly as the atmospheric pressure dropped. His ears swiveled constantly, reading signs that human senses couldn't detect. Occasionally he would stop and test the air, his nostrils flaring as he sorted through the complex mixture of scents that painted a picture of the world around them. "You feel it too, don't you?" Malu murmured, stroking the mule's neck. "Storm's coming, and we're in the worst possible place for it." Flash floods were the hidden killers of the desert southwest, claiming more lives than rattlesnakes. Mountain lions and Apache raiders combined. When the rains came to the high country, the water gathered force as it rushed downhill, turning peaceful canyons into death traps that could sweep away anything in their path. But retreat wasn't an option. Every hour they delayed gave the bandits more time to disappear into the maze of canyons ahead, and more time for whatever larger plan they were executing to unfold. Tommy Henderson's life hung in the balance, and Malu had given his word to bring the boy home. They pushed forward as the first fat raindrops began to fall, each one hitting the red sandstone with a sound like a small gunshot. Within minutes, the occasional drops became a steady patter, and the patter became a driving rain that turned the narrow canyon floor slick and treacherous. Cisco picked his way carefully through the growing stream that was beginning to form at the bottom of the wash. His mountain-bred instincts told him to seek higher ground, but he trusted his rider's judgment, even when it led them into what any sensible animal would recognize as danger. The sound of rushing water reached them long before they saw its source, a low rumble that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth. Somewhere upstream, the storm was already doing its deadly work, turning peaceful tributaries into torrents that would soon converge in the main channel they were following. "We need shelter," Malu said, scanning the canyon walls for any break in the sheer rock face that might offer refuge. "And we need it now." Cisco's ears pricked forward suddenly, and he turned his head toward a barely visible cleft in the northern wall. What had looked like just another shadow in the weathered sandstone revealed itself as a narrow opening, wide enough for a man and mule, but hidden from casual observation. They squeezed through the opening just as the roar of approaching floodwater filled the canyon behind them. The alcove was larger than it appeared from outside, carved from the living rock by centuries of wind and water. Ancient pictographs decorated the walls, spirals and animal figures that spoke of other travelers who had sought shelter in this same place generations ago. As they waited for the flash flood to pass, Malu studied the symbols by the flickering light of a small fire. His grandfather had taught him to read the old signs, to understand the messages left by Apache travelers who had passed this way before the white man ever set foot in this country. One symbol caught his attention, the figure of a man and a four-legged animal, not a horse, but something with longer ears and a different stance. Below it, painted in the same ancient ochre pigment, was the sign for safe passage and hidden water. Even the old ones knew, he said softly, running his fingers over the weathered paint. They knew that sometimes the best choice isn't the obvious one. Cisco stood patiently in the cave mouth, occasionally shaking the water from his coat, but otherwise unbothered by the chaos outside. The roar of the flood gradually diminished as the storm moved on, leaving behind only the drip of water from overhanging rocks and the fresh, clean smell of rain-washed desert. When they finally emerged from their shelter, the canyon had been transformed. The floor was scoured clean, revealing tracks and sign that had been hidden beneath years of accumulated debris. Among the fresh deposits left by the flood, Malu found more evidence of their quarry's passage: a piece of military-issue rope and a brass button from a cavalry uniform. The broken saber, the uniform button, and the military rope painted a picture that was becoming increasingly clear. These weren't random bandits who had stumbled into kidnapping as a way to make money. They were deserters, men who had turned their military training to criminal purposes, using their knowledge of tactics and terrain to stay one step ahead of any pursuit. But they had made one critical error. They had assumed that anyone following them would think like they did, would choose the fastest horse and the most obvious route. They hadn't counted on a tracker who understood that sometimes the longest way around was also the safest way through. As the sun broke through the clearing clouds, painting the wet canyon walls in brilliant shades of red and gold, Malu and Cisco resumed their careful pursuit. The flood had washed away the easy-to-follow tracks, but it had also revealed older sign that told the story of how often these men had used this route. They were close now, close enough that Cisco's enhanced senses were picking up traces of smoke and the distant sound of voices. Somewhere ahead, in a canyon that no ordinary posse could have reached, desperate men were holding a 15-year-old boy whose only crime was being in the wrong place when greed and desperation finally overcame whatever honor they might once have possessed. The storm had passed, leaving the desert air clean and sharp with the scent of sage and wet stone. As Malu and Cisco made their way through a maze of towering sandstone formations, the tracker felt the familiar stirring that came when the ancestors seemed close. When the boundary between past and present grew thin, they emerged into a circular canyon unlike any other in the Badlands, a sacred place that Malu's grandfather had described in hushed, reverent tones around winter fires. The walls rose straight up for hundreds of feet, carved by wind and water into flowing curves that seemed to capture and hold the desert light. Ancient petroglyphs covered every available surface, telling stories in stone that stretched back countless generations. At the center of the canyon, near a small spring that had never failed even in the driest years, lay a single eagle feather. It was perfect and unmarked, as if it had been placed there specifically for someone who would understand its significance. Malu dismounted and approached the feather with the reverence it deserved. In Apache tradition, the eagle was the messenger between earth and sky, between the world of men and the realm of spirits. To find such a feather in such a place, at such a time, was no accident. As he knelt to retrieve the gift, Cisco moved to the spring and drank deeply. his presence in this sacred space as natural and fitting as if he had been born to it. The mule showed no nervousness, no sense that he was intruding on something beyond his understanding. He simply accepted the blessing of clean water and good grass as gifts to be received with gratitude. Malu held the eagle feather up to catch the filtered sunlight that streamed down between the canyon walls. The stories his grandfather had told came flooding back, tales of warriors who had received guidance in places like this, who had found the strength to continue when all seemed lost. "Grandfather," he whispered in the old language, "show me the way. Help me bring this boy home safely." The wind stirred through the canyon, rustling the feather in his hand and carrying with it what might have been an answer or might have been only the desert's eternal song. But as Malu listened, he felt a settling in his spirit, a quiet confidence that came from knowing he walked the right path. They spent the night in the sacred canyon, both man and mule drawing strength from its ancient peace. Cisco grazed contentedly on the rich grass that grew near the spring, while Malu performed the traditional ceremonies his grandfather had taught him, asking for protection and guidance in the trials that lay ahead. As dawn broke over the rim of the canyon, painting the walls in shades of rose and gold, they resumed their pursuit with renewed purpose. The eagle feather was tucked safely in Malu's medicine bundle, alongside his grandfather's tracking stone and the other sacred objects that connected him to the wisdom of his people. The bandits' trail led them out of the sacred canyon and into even more treacherous country, a landscape of knife-edge ridges and bottomless chasms where one misstep could mean death. Here the full value of Cisco's mountain heritage became apparent. The mule navigated narrow ledges that would have terrified a horse, his hooves finding purchase on rock faces that seemed impossibly steep. At one point, they had to traverse a natural bridge of stone, barely wide enough for Cisco's shoulders, with a drop of several hundred feet on either side. The mule approached the crossing with calm deliberation, testing each step before committing his weight, trusting in his own experience and his rider's judgment. "Easy, partner," Malu murmured, feeling the animal's muscles tense beneath him as they picked their way across the precarious span. "We've done worse than this before." It was true, though barely. 3 years earlier, they had crossed an even narrower ledge while tracking rustlers in the Dragoon Mountains. That time, a sudden rockslide had nearly claimed them both, and only Cisco's quick thinking and sure footing had saved their lives. Beyond the stone bridge, the character of the country changed again. The canyons grew wider but more complex, branching and converging in a maze that could easily confuse even experienced trackers. But the bandits' trail remained clear to eyes that knew how to read it: broken twigs on desert willows, disturbed stones, and the occasional clear hoofprint in patches of soft sand. They were climbing steadily now, following switchbacks that led toward the high mesas, where the air was thinner and the views stretched for dozens of miles in every direction. It was country that few men had ever seen, accessible only to those with the skill and determination to navigate the deadly approaches. As they rounded a sharp bend in the trail, Malu caught his first glimpse of their destination, a massive cliff dwelling, tucked into an alcove, high on the face of a towering mesa. The ancient pueblo had been abandoned for centuries, but someone had recently reoccupied it. Judging by the thin wisps of smoke rising from what had once been ceremonial chambers, the location was perfect from a defensive standpoint. The only approach was up a treacherous trail that could be easily defended by a few men with rifles. Any conventional rescue attempt would be suicidal. The attackers would be exposed on the narrow path, while the defenders held the high ground with perfect fields of fire. But as Malu studied the cliff dwelling through his grandfather's field glasses, he began to see possibilities that others might miss. The ancient builders had carved handholds and footholds into the rock face, creating alternate routes that were invisible from below. Most importantly, there was a narrow chimney in the rock that led directly to the back of the pueblo, a route that only someone with Cisco's climbing ability could possibly negotiate. "Now I understand," he said softly, stroking the mule's neck. This is why we needed each other. This is why the ancestors brought us together. The plan that formed in his mind was audacious, perhaps even foolhardy, but it was also the only approach that offered any real chance of success. While the bandits watched the main trail, confident that no rescue could reach them, he and Cisco would attempt the impossible climb up the back wall of the mesa. As the sun reached its zenith, they made camp in a hidden grove of juniper trees where a seep provided water and the dense vegetation offered concealment. Malu spent the afternoon studying the cliff dwelling, memorizing every detail of its construction and the surrounding terrain. The eagle feather seemed to pulse with warmth in his medicine bundle, reminding him that he was not alone in this endeavor. His grandfather's spirit rode with him, along with the accumulated wisdom of generations of Apache warriors who had faced impossible odds and found a way to prevail. Cisco dozed in the shade, conserving his strength for the ordeal ahead. The mule's scars told the story of a dozen similar challenges overcome through patience, skill, and the kind of trust that could only be built over years of shared dangers. As evening approached and the first stars appeared in the desert sky, Malu performed the ritual preparations his grandfather had taught him. He painted his face with ochre clay, sang the old songs in the ancient language, and asked the spirits of this place to watch over a 15-year-old boy whose only crime had been being in the wrong place when desperate men decided to use innocence as leverage in their deadly games. The climb up the back wall of the mesa began in the pre-dawn darkness, when the ancient handholds carved by long-dead Pueblo builders were still cool to the touch. Cisco followed the narrow chimney in the rock, with the patient precision that had carried them through a dozen impossible situations, his hooves finding purchase on stone that seemed too steep for any four-legged creature to navigate. 3 hours later, they reached the back of the cliff dwelling just as the sun cleared the eastern horizon. Malu dismounted carefully, every muscle in his body protesting the strain of the ascent, but his mind sharp with the focus that came from knowing lives hung in the balance. The ancient Pueblo was larger than it had appeared from below, with dozens of rooms carved directly into the living rock. Recent occupation was evident in the scattered equipment and supplies. But what caught Malu's attention was the deliberate organization of it all. This wasn't the random accumulation of desperate men hiding from the law, moving with the silence his grandfather had taught him. Malu crept through the shadowed chambers toward the sound of voices. What he discovered in the main room of the Pueblo stopped him cold and changed everything he thought he knew about their situation. Tommy Henderson sat in the corner, alive but pale, his hands bound but his spirit unbroken. That was the good news. The devastating revelation came from the papers scattered across a makeshift table, military documents, survey maps, and most shocking of all, a signed military commission bearing the seal of the territorial government. The signature at the bottom made Malu's blood run cold. Captain James Morrison, formerly of the 7th Cavalry, now apparently working under direct orders from someone with enough authority to issue military-grade equipment and detailed intelligence reports. But it was the second set of documents that truly shattered his understanding of the situation. Hidden beneath the official papers was a bundle of correspondence in handwriting he recognized, Buck Harrison's distinctive scrawl, detailing payments, schedules, and most damning of all, a list of targets for future operations. The truth hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't a random kidnapping by desperate men. It was part of a larger conspiracy, with Buck Harrison financing and directing a campaign of terror designed to drive small ranchers off their land so he could buy it at fraction of its value. Tommy Henderson hadn't been taken by bandits. He had been taken by Buck Harrison's hired guns. Professional soldiers turned criminals under the direction of the very man who had offered his finest horses for the rescue mission. "The boy's more trouble than he's worth," a gravelly voice said from the main chamber, and Malu recognized the older man he had seen at the previous camp. "Maybe we should we stick to the plan," came the sharp reply from Captain Morrison. Harrison's paying us enough to retire comfortably, but only if we follow his instructions exactly. The boy stays alive until we get the all clear. Malu eased closer to the edge of the chamber, where he could see the full scope of the operation. Morrison was indeed a professional soldier, his bearing and equipment marking him as someone who had seen real combat. The other three men showed similar military discipline, and their weapons were all military issue, not surplus, but current inventory that someone with significant authority had diverted to this operation. The stolen deeds scattered across the table told the complete story. The Henderson Ranch was just one of more than a dozen properties Harrison planned to acquire through intimidation and staged kidnappings. Families would be terrorized into selling, and those who refused would face escalating violence until they had no choice but to flee. "When do we get word from Harrison?" one of the younger soldiers asked, nervousness evident in his voice. "Soon," Morrison replied, studying a detailed map that showed not just the current operation, but future targets marked in red ink. "He's playing the concerned citizen back in Copper Ridge, probably offering rewards and organizing search parties that will conveniently fail to find anything." The cynical laughter that followed chilled Malu's blood. These men weren't desperate criminals driven by circumstances. They were predators who had found a way to use their military training for personal profit, with no regard for the innocent lives they destroyed in the process. More disturbing was the realization that Buck Harrison had played everyone perfectly. His offer of any horse for the rescue mission hadn't been generous, it had been calculated. He knew that anyone choosing one of his prized animals would follow predictable routes, would make enough noise to be detected and eliminated long before they could threaten the operation. Only Malu's choice of the old mule had upset Harrison's plans. Cisco's ability to navigate impossible terrain had brought them to the one place Harrison never expected anyone to reach. The very choice that everyone had mocked was the only thing that could expose the conspiracy and save Tommy Henderson's life. As he studied the captured documents by the filtered morning light, Malu found evidence of Harrison's other operations, staged cattle raids that had driven the widow Martinez from her water rights, a mysterious fire that had convinced old Henrik to sell his mineral claims, and a dozen other incidents that had seemed like random frontier violence, but were actually carefully orchestrated campaign of terrorism. The scope of the corruption was staggering. Harrison wasn't just stealing land. He was systematically destroying the lives of anyone who stood between him and complete control of the region's most valuable resources. And he was using men trained by the United States Army to do it, perverting their oath to protect and defend into a tool for personal enrichment. Tommy stirred in his corner, and Malu caught the boy's attention with a slight gesture. The teenager's eyes widened with hope and relief, but to his credit, he made no sound that might alert his captors. 15 years old, but already showing the kind of courage that would serve him well if they could get him out of this alive. The bundle of stolen deeds represented dozens of families, hundreds of innocent people whose lives had been destroyed by Harrison's greed. Some had fled the territory entirely, driven away by violence they never understood. Others had died defending property they thought was being attacked by random bandits, never knowing they were fighting a war they couldn't win against an enemy they couldn't identify. But now Malu knew the truth. He had the evidence that could expose the conspiracy and bring justice to the families Harrison had destroyed. The question was whether he could get Tommy and the documents back to Copper Ridge alive, knowing that Harrison's hired killers would do anything to prevent that from happening. As he prepared to make his move, Malu felt the weight of his grandfather's tracking stone in his pocket and the warmth of the eagle feather in his medicine bundle. The spirits of this place had guided him to this moment of revelation, but the hardest part of the journey still lay ahead. Morrison was checking his pocket watch, a nervous habit that suggested he was expecting some kind of signal or communication. Whatever timeline Harrison was working under, events were moving towards some kind of climax that would put Tommy Henderson in even greater danger. There was no more time for observation or planning. The truth was more terrible than Malu had imagined, but it was also the key to saving not just one boy, but an entire community from a predator who wore the mask of respectability while orchestrating campaigns of terror from the shadows. The rescue had to happen now, before Morrison received whatever signal he was expecting from Buck Harrison. Malu studied the layout of the ancient pueblo one more time, memorizing the positions of the 4 soldiers and planning a route that would get him to Tommy without alerting the guards. The bundle of stolen deeds lay tantalizingly close on the makeshift table, but reaching them would mean crossing the main chamber where Morrison kept watch. The evidence was crucial. Without it, his word against Buck Harrison's would never be enough to convince the people of Copper Ridge that their most successful citizen was also their greatest enemy, moving with the silence his grandfather had taught him during long nights in the desert. Malu crept through the shadow chambers toward Tommy's position. The boy had shown remarkable courage, remaining quiet despite his fear, and now his self-control might mean the difference between rescue and disaster. A loose stone shifted under Malu's foot, making the faintest scraping sound against the ancient floor. He froze, hardly daring to breathe, as one of the younger soldiers looked up from his card game and listened to the morning sounds filtering through the pueblo. "Thought I heard something," the man muttered. But Morrison waved him off with the casual authority of a career officer. "Just the wind through the ruins," Morrison said, without looking up from the map he was studying. "This old place makes sounds all day long. Been doing it for centuries before we got here, and it'll keep doing it long after we're gone." The exchange gave Malu the opening he needed. While the soldiers were distracted, he covered the last few yards to Tommy's corner and quickly cut the ropes that bound the boy's hands. Tommy's eyes went wide with gratitude and hope, but he had the presence of mind to remain silent as Malu helped him to his feet. Getting back to Cisco would be the easy part. The ancient builders had carved multiple routes through the pueblo, and Malu had already identified the safest path. But leaving without the stolen deeds would doom every family on Harrison's target list to the same fate that had befallen the Hendersons. He gestured for Tommy to stay put while he crept toward the main chamber where the evidence lay scattered across the table. This was the most dangerous part of the rescue, requiring him to get within arm's reach of 4 armed men who would shoot first and ask questions later if they discovered his presence. Morrison had moved away from the table to check something on his map, but he could return at any moment. The stolen deeds were right there, inches away from Malu's reaching fingers, representing the proof needed to expose Harrison's conspiracy and bring justice to its victims. Just as his hand closed around the bundle of documents, Tommy Henderson made the kind of mistake that 15-year-old boys make under pressure. A loose stone rolled under his foot, clattering across the chamber floor with a sound that might as well have been a gunshot in the morning silence. What the hell was that? Morrison spun around, his hand automatically moving to the pistol at his hip. Malu grabbed the deeds and sprinted toward Tommy's position as the soldiers scrambled for their weapons. The boy was already moving toward the back of the pueblo where Cisco waited, but the narrow passages that had concealed their approach now worked against them as they tried to escape. "The boy's gone," one of the soldiers shouted, and suddenly the ancient pueblo erupted in chaos as 4 armed men spread out to block every possible escape route. But they had made the same mistake as everyone else. They assumed their quarry would follow predictable patterns, would take the obvious routes that any reasonable person would choose. They didn't account for an Apache tracker who had spent his life finding ways through country that others considered impassable. Malu and Tommy reached Cisco just as the first bullets began ricocheting off the canyon walls. The mule showed no panic at the sound of gunfire, having been through enough dangerous situations to trust his rider's judgment even when circumstances seemed desperate. "Hold on tight," Malu told Tommy as they started down the treacherous chimney that had brought them up the back wall of the mesa. "And whatever happens, don't let go." The descent that had taken 3 careful hours on the way up now had to be accomplished in minutes, with armed men above them and certain death below if they made a single misstep. Cisco navigated the narrow cracks in the rock with desperate precision, his hooves finding purchase on stone faces that seemed impossibly steep. Behind them, Morrison's voice echoed off the canyon walls as he directed his men to positions where they could cover the only routes he knew about. But the captain had never served in Apache country, had never learned that there were always more ways through the desert than appeared on any military map. "They can't have gone far," Morrison shouted. "Spread out and check every canyon. Harrison wants that boy back alive. But if we have to choose between the boy and those documents, we know which one's more important." The confirmation that Morrison was indeed working for Harrison added urgency to their escape. If the soldiers caught them, Tommy would be expendable compared to the evidence that could destroy their entire operation. They reached the bottom of the mesa just as the sun climbed high enough to begin burning off the morning shadows. In full daylight, they would be visible to anyone with field glasses, but the maze of canyons ahead offered multiple routes back toward Copper Ridge. Cisco settled into his ground-eating pace, carrying double weight without complaint as they put distance between themselves and the cliff dwelling. The mule seemed to understand that this was no time for his usual careful consideration of each step. Speed was now more important than absolute safety. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew louder as Morrison's men reached the bottom of the mesa and began following their trail. These were experienced soldiers with good horses and military training in tracking and pursuit. Under normal circumstances, they would run down their quarry within hours, but these weren't normal circumstances. They were pursuing a man and mule who knew every hidden trail and secret passage in the Badlands, who understood the desert in ways that no amount of military training could teach. Tommy proved to be a steady companion, asking no questions and making no complaints as they pushed deeper into country that grew more treacherous with each mile. The boy had the good sense to trust completely in Malu's judgment, even when their route seemed to lead them into obvious dead ends. More than once, Cisco found passages through the rock maze that seemed impossible, narrow cracks barely wide enough for his body, ledges that appeared solid but required perfect balance to navigate, and water sources hidden in places where no map would ever mark them. The stolen deeds rode safely in Malu's saddlebags, each document representing a family that Harrison had destroyed and others he planned to target. Getting this evidence back to Copper Ridge would expose the conspiracy, but only if they could stay ahead of professional killers who had every reason to ensure that neither they nor their secrets ever saw civilization again. The race back to Copper Ridge became a deadly game of cat and mouse through the most treacherous country in the Arizona Territory. Behind them, Morrison's men pushed their cavalry mounts hard, following a trail that should have been easy to read in the morning light. But Malu had spent 43 years learning every secret the desert had to teach, and now those lessons would determine whether justice or conspiracy prevailed. Tommy Henderson rode behind him without complaint, the boy's natural courage rising to meet the desperate circumstances. In his saddlebags, the bundle of stolen deeds and Harrison's correspondence represented the evidence that could expose years of coordinated terrorism and bring justice to dozens of murdered and dispossessed families. But first they had to survive long enough to deliver that evidence to people who would act on it. The original land survey stakes that Malu had discovered among the stolen papers told a story that was both simpler and more complex than he had first realized. Harrison hadn't just been stealing individual properties. He had been systematically acquiring sections of land that, when combined, would give him control over the territory's most valuable water rights and mineral deposits. "Mr. Malu," Tommy called out during a brief rest while Cisco drank from a hidden seep, "are we really going to make it home?" The boy's question deserved an honest answer, not false comfort. Morrison's men were experienced cavalry soldiers with good horses and military training in pursuit tactics. Under normal circumstances, they would eventually run down any quarry in open country. "We're going to try our best," Malu replied, checking the loads in his rifle while keeping watch on their back trail. "Your folks are waiting for you, and there are a lot of other people who need to know the truth about what's been happening to their neighbors." The truth was that their chances depended entirely on Cisco's ability to navigate terrain that would break the spirit and legs of Morrison's cavalry mounts. The network of narrow canyons and hidden passages ahead offered multiple routes home, but each one carried its own deadly risks. They pushed deeper into the maze as the sun climbed toward its zenith, following paths that appeared on no map and were known only to Apache hunters and the occasional prospector crazy enough to risk his life searching for silver in country that wanted to kill him. The first real test came at Devil's Backbone, a knife-edge ridge barely wide enough for a single horse, with drops of several hundred feet on both sides. Most animals would balk at such an obstacle, and sensible riders wouldn't ask them to try it, but Cisco approached the crossing with the same calm deliberation he had shown at every other challenge. The mule tested his footing carefully, then started across the narrow spine of rock, with Tommy clinging desperately to Malu's back. Behind them, they could hear Morrison's frustrated cursing as his men were forced to find another route around the obstacle that would add hours to their pursuit. Military horses, no matter how well trained, couldn't match a mountain-bred mule's ability to navigate impossible terrain. "How does he do it?" Tommy whispered in amazement as they reached the far side of the ridge safely. "He thinks before he acts," Malu replied, stroking the mule's neck affectionately. "Most animals react to fear. Cisco considers his options and chooses the safest path, even if it doesn't look safe to anyone else." The lesson applied to more than just crossing narrow ridges. Everything that had happened over the past few days had been about the difference between making choices based on appearance versus making them based on wisdom and experience. Buck Harrison had counted on people making the obvious choices, taking the predictable routes that his hired killers could easily intercept. The rancher's entire conspiracy depended on victims and potential rescuers behaving exactly as he expected them to. But Malu's choice of the scarred old mule had upset those calculations from the very beginning. Now, as they approached the final stretch of their desperate journey, that choice was about to be tested in ways that would determine whether truth or corruption prevailed in Copper Ridge. They were still 10 miles from town when they heard the sound that chilled both their hearts, the thunder of hooves on hard ground, growing steadily louder as Morrison's men finally found a route that allowed them to close the distance. "They're gaining on us," Tommy said, his voice tight with fear but still steady. Malu urged Cisco to greater speed, but the mule was already carrying double weight over some of the most difficult terrain in the southwest. They needed an advantage that pure speed couldn't provide, needed to find terrain that would neutralize the cavalry horses' superior numbers, and training ahead lay a section of country that locals called the Devil's Garden, a maze of weathered sandstone formations that created a natural labyrinth where a man could lose himself within 100 yards of a main trail. It was dangerous ground full of dead ends and false passages that had claimed lives over the years, but it was also the kind of country where Cisco's patient intelligence would serve them. Better than his pursuers' speed and aggression, they plunged into the maze just as the first bullets began whistling overhead. Morrison's men had closed to rifle range, close enough to end the chase if they could get a clear shot at their fleeing quarry. The sandstone formations rose on all sides like the walls of a vast cathedral, carved by wind and water into fantastic shapes that confused the eye and played tricks with sound. In this place, echoes could make one man sound like 5, and a wrong turn could lead to a box canyon with no escape. Cisco navigated the twisting passages with the sure-footed confidence that came from years of experience in similar terrain. His hooves made almost no sound on the sandy floor, while behind them the cavalry horses' steel shoes rang against stone like bells, announcing their position to anyone with ears to hear. "This way," one of Morrison's men called out, his voice echoing confusingly off the canyon walls. "I can see their dust trail, but dust trails could be deceptive in the Devil's Garden, and Malu knew passages that led in circles, routes that appeared to go in one direction but actually doubled back toward their starting point. He had spent years learning the secrets of this place, knowledge that no military manual could provide. They emerged from the maze 3 miles closer to Copper Ridge, with their pursuers still trying to untangle themselves from the false trails and dead ends. It was the kind of advantage that might make the difference between life and death in the final confrontation that was now inevitable, because Buck Harrison would be waiting for them in Copper Ridge, probably with more hired guns, and certainly with a story that would make him the hero and Malu the villain. The stolen deeds in his saddlebags were proof of the conspiracy. But Harrison had spent years building his reputation as the territory's most successful and respected citizen. As they crested the final ridge before Copper Ridge came into view, Malu made a decision that would determine how the final confrontation played out. Instead of riding straight into town, where Harrison could control the narrative, they would approach from an unexpected direction and gather allies who would listen to the truth. Sarah Chen had always been fair in her dealings, had shown respect for Malu's judgment even when others doubted. Old Pete had the kind of experience that would help him recognize military equipment and tactics when he saw them. And Martha Henderson deserved to know the truth about who had really orchestrated her family's nightmare. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon as they made their final approach to Copper Ridge, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere behind them, Morrison's men were still trying to find their way out of the Devil's Garden. But they would reach town eventually. When they did, the final confrontation between truth and conspiracy would play out in the dusty streets of a frontier town where people had learned to make hard choices based on incomplete information. The evidence in Malu's saddlebags would speak for itself, but only if he could stay alive long enough to present it to people who would act on what they learned. Tommy Henderson had survived his ordeal with remarkable courage, but the real test of his character would come in the next few hours, when his testimony might mean the difference between justice and continued oppression for dozens of innocent families. As Copper Ridge's buildings came into view, Malu felt the weight of his grandfather's tracking stone and the warmth of the sacred eagle feather that had guided him through the darkest moments of this journey. The ancestors had brought him this far, but the final steps would require all the wisdom and courage he had learned in 43 years of walking between two worlds. They reached Copper Ridge as the afternoon shadows were growing long, approaching from the east, where the desert met the settlement in a ragged line of adobe buildings and weathered corrals. Malu could see people gathered around the trading post, probably discussing search parties and rescue attempts that Buck Harrison would ensure never came close to finding the truth. As they rode down the main street, heads turned and voices rose in amazement. Tommy Henderson was alive, riding behind the Apache tracker on a scarred old mule that had somehow accomplished what everyone said was impossible. Martha Henderson's scream of joy could be heard 3 blocks away as she ran from her husband's side toward her returned son. Jack Henderson followed close behind, tears streaming down his weathered face as he reached up to help his boy down from Cisco's back. "Tommy!" "Oh, my boy, my precious boy," Martha sobbed, clutching her son as if she might never let him go again. But even in the midst of the emotional reunion, Malu kept his attention focused on Buck Harrison, who had emerged from the trading post with the expression that managed to combine relief, congratulations, and barely concealed anger. "Malu, my friend," Harrison called out, his voice carrying the hearty bonhomie that had made him successful in business and politics. "You've accomplished the impossible. Though I have to say, I'm surprised that old Mule managed to get you there and back." The crowd that gathered around them included most of the town's important citizens: Sheriff Coleman, Sarah Chen, Old Pete, and a dozen others who had been organizing search efforts and rescue attempts. They all looked at Malu with new respect, but their attention was focused on the miraculous return of Tommy Henderson rather than the larger implications of what had happened. Malu reached into his saddlebags and withdrew the bundle of stolen deeds and military correspondence that would expose Harrison's conspiracy. But before he could speak, Morrison and his 3 surviving men rode hard into town, their cavalry mounts lathered with sweat and their faces grim with the knowledge that their entire operation was falling apart. "That's them." Tommy Henderson pointed at Morrison with a steady finger, his young voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet street. "That's the man who kidnapped me, and those are his soldiers." The crowd's mood shifted instantly from celebration to confusion and fear. These weren't the desperate bandits they had expected. These were professional soldiers with military bearing and equipment that spoke of official sanction rather than criminal enterprise. Morrison's hand moved toward his pistol, but Sheriff Coleman was already drawing his own weapon, finally understanding that the situation was far more complex than anyone had realized. "Hold it right there," Coleman commanded, his voice carrying the authority of 12 years, keeping the peace in frontier communities. "Nobody moves until we sort this out." But Buck Harrison wasn't finished playing his role as the concerned citizen and generous benefactor. He stepped forward with the confidence of a man who had spent years building his reputation and wasn't about to let it crumble without a fight. "Sheriff, I think there's been some mistake," Harrison said smoothly. "These men were part of the search effort I organized. Captain Morrison here is a decorated cavalry officer who volunteered to help when he heard about the kidnapping. It was a masterful performance, delivered with just the right mixture of confusion and concern. If Malu hadn't seen the evidence with his own eyes, he might have believed it himself, but he was carrying his father's medicine pouch, the sacred bundle that connected him to generations of Apache wisdom, and the spiritual strength that had carried him through the darkest moments of this journey. The ancestors had not guided him this far to let lies triumph over truth. "Captain Morrison kidnapped Tommy Henderson on your orders," Malu said quietly, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of a man who had seen the evidence and understood its implications. "These documents prove it." He held up the bundle of papers, military correspondence, stolen deeds, and most damning of all, Harrison's own handwriting detailing payments and instructions for a campaign of terrorism designed to drive families from their land. Harrison's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the cold calculation that lay beneath his practiced charm. But he recovered quickly, turning to face the crowd with the wounded dignity of an innocent man wrongly accused. "This is preposterous," Harrison declared, his voice rising with righteous indignation. "Sheriff, this man is obviously trying to deflect attention from his own incompetence. How do we know he didn't stage this whole thing himself?" It was a clever strategy, exploiting the racial prejudices and social divisions that had always made Malu's position in the community precarious. Some of the crowd began to murmur agreement, unsure who to believe in the face of such dramatically conflicting stories. But Sarah Chen stepped forward, her practical mind cutting through the emotional manipulation to focus on the evidence that could be verified. "Let's see those papers," she said firmly, extending her hand toward Malu. "If they prove what you say they prove, then we need to know about it. If they don't, then Mr. Harrison deserves an apology." Old Pete moved to stand beside Sarah, his weathered face grim with the recognition of a situation spiraling toward violence. "I've seen enough cavalry operations to know what military equipment looks like," he said, studying Morrison and his men with experienced eyes. "And I ain't never seen search parties armed like they're going to war." The tension in the street was thick enough to cut as the two sides faced each other. Malu and Tommy Henderson with the evidence that could expose years of coordinated crime, against Buck Harrison and Captain Morrison with their weapons and carefully constructed lies. Tommy Henderson, showing courage far beyond his 15 years, stepped away from his parents' protective embrace and walked to the center of the street where everyone could see and hear him clearly. "Mr. Harrison visited their camp twice while I was there," the boy said, his voice steady despite the enormous pressure of the moment. He brought money and maps, and he told Captain Morrison which families to target next. I heard everything they said. The words hit the crowd like a physical blow, stripping away Harrison's pretense and revealing the truth that many had sensed but never been able to prove. Neighbors began to remember incidents that had seemed like random bad luck, but now fit the pattern of a coordinated campaign of terrorism. Morrison's hand was now openly resting on his pistol grip, and his men had spread out to cover multiple angles of fire. They were outnumbered but professionally trained, and they had every reason to fight rather than surrender to frontier justice. But they had made the same mistake as everyone else. They had underestimated the quiet mule standing patiently in the middle of the street, seemingly unimportant but positioned exactly where his presence would matter most. 3 months later, the morning sun painted Copper Ridge in shades of gold as the entire community gathered for a celebration that would be remembered for generations. Tommy Henderson stood tall and healthy, his ordeal having matured him into a young man whose courage under pressure had helped expose one of the territory's most extensive criminal conspiracies. Buck Harrison was serving time in the territorial prison. His empire of stolen land and extorted wealth returned to its rightful owners through the evidence Malu had carried back in his saddlebags. Captain Morrison and his surviving men faced court-martial for desertion and civilian crimes. Their military training, perverted into tools of oppression, finally brought to justice. The stolen deeds had indeed told the complete story of Harrison's operations: 17 ranches, 43 individual homesteads, and mineral rights to thousands of acres, all acquired through intimidation, staged attacks, and the systematic terrorizing of families who had committed no crime beyond standing between Harrison and his insatiable greed. Sarah Chen had expanded the trading post with funds recovered from Harrison's hidden accounts, using the additional space to establish a small school where children from the surrounding ranches could receive education without traveling to distant settlements. She stood now on the porch of her expanded store, watching the ceremony with the satisfaction of someone who had always known that true worth couldn't be measured by appearances alone. Old Pete sat in his customary place on the trading post steps, whittling a piece of juniper and sharing the story with a group of travelers who had stopped to rest their horses. His version of events had grown slightly more dramatic with each telling, but the essential truth remained unchanged. Sometimes the best choice wasn't the obvious one. At the center of the celebration stood Cisco, wearing a new bridle handcrafted by the grateful community from the finest leather and decorated with silver conchos that caught the morning light. The bridle was beautiful, but more importantly, it represented recognition of true worth that had nothing to do with breeding or appearance, and everything to do with character, endurance, and the kind of loyalty that couldn't be bought or sold. Malu ran his hand along the mule's neck, feeling the familiar scars that had once marked Cisco as an outcast among the flashy horses in Buck Harrison's corral. Now those same scars were recognized for what they had always been: proof of experience, evidence of survival, badges of honor earned through years of faithful service in country that demanded everything and forgave nothing. "Thank you," Martha Henderson said quietly, approaching with tears in her eyes and a smile that spoke of gratitude too deep for words. "Not just for bringing Tommy home, but for showing all of us that wisdom sometimes wears unexpected faces." The new bridal ceremony was more than just a gift from a grateful community. It was an acknowledgement that the values Copper Ridge claimed to honor had been tested and proven in the crucible of real danger. The flashy horses that everyone had admired were still beautiful animals, but they were no longer the measure by which worth was judged. Jack Henderson stepped forward with a leather-bound ledger book, its pages filled with the names of every family that Harrison's conspiracy had touched. Some were deceased, victims of violence they never understood. Others had fled the territory, driven away by terror campaigns they couldn't fight because they didn't know who their real enemy was. "We're going to make sure none of these families are forgotten," Henderson announced to the assembled crowd, And we're going to make sure this never happens again. Because now we know that the most dangerous enemies sometimes hide behind the most respectable faces. The lessons learned went far beyond the specific crimes of Buck Harrison and his hired soldiers. The community had discovered that survival sometimes required looking past surface appearances to recognize true value, that wisdom often came disguised as foolishness, and that the longest path might also be the safest one. Tommy Henderson had used his recovery time to carve a new wooden horse. This one modeled not after Buck Harrison's prize stallion, but after the scarred old mule who had carried him safely home. The boy presented it to Malu with a ceremony that spoke of respect earned through shared danger and mutual trust. "I used to think the best animals were the fastest and the prettiest," Tommy said, his voice carrying the maturity that comes from facing real danger and emerging intact. "Now I know that the best ones are the ones who never quit, no matter how hard things get." As the formal ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse into smaller groups sharing stories and renewing friendships, Malu found himself thinking about his grandfather's teachings. The old Apache had been right about so many things: the importance of patience, the value of endurance, the wisdom that came from understanding that true strength wasn't always the most obvious. The eagle feather from the sacred canyon remained in Malu's medicine bundle, along with his grandfather's tracking stone and the other sacred objects that connected him to the wisdom of generations. But now he carried something else as well: the knowledge that his choices had not only saved one boy's life, but had protected an entire community from predators who wore the masks of respectability. Sarah. Chen approached as he was preparing to head home, carrying a small bundle wrapped in blue cloth. "This came in on yesterday's supply wagon," she said with a smile that suggested she knew more about its contents than she was revealing. "From the Territorial Governor's Office." Inside the bundle was an official commendation recognizing Malu's service to the community and his role in exposing Harrison's conspiracy. More meaningful was the accompanying letter, written in the governor's own hand, acknowledging that true heroism often came from unexpected sources and wore faces that others might overlook. As the sun set over Copper Ridge, painting the desert in familiar shades of gold and crimson, Malu led Cisco toward the small adobe house they called home. The mule walked with the same steady pace that had carried them through impossible dangers, his new bridle glinting in the dying light, but his essential character unchanged by recognition or celebration. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose between the obvious path and the wise one. There would be cattle to track, travelers to guide, and probably other mysteries to solve in country that kept its secrets until they were earned through patience and understanding. But tonight, as Cisco grazed peacefully in the small corral behind the house and the first stars appeared in the desert sky, Malu felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing that sometimes, when it really matters, wisdom does triumph over appearances, and the right choice is vindicated by results rather than popular opinion. The people of Copper Ridge had learned that true worth couldn't be measured by surface beauty or popular acclaim, but only by the kind of character that revealed itself under pressure. And they had learned it from an Apache tracker and his scarred old mule, both of whom had always known that the most important qualities were often the least visible ones.